Thank you, Patrick, for a very kind introduction, and my thanks to Diana and Amara for the invitation. I will start promptly so as to be in time. On 23rd August 1962, a group of 12 young artists, next slide, assembled in the residence of Jyoti and Jayant Pandya in the quiet suburban town of Bhavnagar to plot an artistic revolution over the course of 2 sleepless days and nights of conversation and debate. 1890, the numerical moniker with which the collective christened itself, did not refer to a year in any calendar, Gregorian or otherwise. Neither did it function as a code enunciating an abstruse aesthetic proposition, nor did it signal any specific ideological position. Instead, the moniker simply acknowledged a coming together of people in place. 1890 was the number of the house where the group had gathered to draft their manifesto. Other than that, the number held no other additional significance. Next slide. A year later, in 1963, the collective heralded its presence with an exhibition, the resonance of which the Mexican poet Octavio Paz described as akin to being surrounded by infinity. The invocation of the word infinity was not purely rhetorical, as we will see, for it wrenched a hole into the idea of history itself. In his introductory note in the exhibition catalogue, Paz, then the Mexican ambassador to India, perceived in the collective a new beginning. The 1963 exhibition, however, both inaugurated and symbolically concluded the collective's existence, even though the individual artists continued to be prolific and gained immense recognition in the years that followed. The synergy between the Group 1890 artists and Paz was no doubt significant. We became friends. We discussed, we laughed, and we remained silent, Paz wrote. The connection was perhaps intuitive. Paz, for instance, believed that he understood India because of Mexico. The bond was strong enough for Paz and for Swaminathan to maintain a lifelong friendship. The former would dedicate a poem to his artist interlocutor, while the latter would go as far as to endure the indignity of a strip search at the hands of American immigration authorities while stopping in the United States to visit Paz during the poet's residency at the University of Texas, Austin. Yet the interactions between the Group 1890 and the Mexican intellectual never amounted to anything like a collaboration. Even as the planning for the group's exhibition in Mexico was well underway, the project was never realized, and the collective unofficially disbanded around 1969. Given the transitory nature of the enterprise, the Group 1890 has thus far appeared as a mere footnote in South Asia's art historiography. I, however, propose we revisit the moment of the Group 1890, not just to unravel intertwined visions that momentarily conjoined India with Mexico, but also to see if we can draw out a different imagination of contemporaneity from the vantage of the global South. My inquiry proceeds through 3 intersecting sites of analysis. I begin by situating the Group 1890 within the shifts in ideations of collectivity that emerged in the 1960s. I then scrutinize the manifesto that the artist authored and the exhibition that served as the group's site of manifestation. In the end, I return to the notion of infinity invoked by Paz in response to the exhibition to calibrate a sense of contemporaneity grounded in place, but simultaneously insinuate a reckoning with the global that hurls it into an entirely different cosmology. Next slide. Arguably, although the Group 1890 was formed in 1962, The movement that eventually led to the inauguration of the collective had begun to gather force from the late 1950s onwards as increasing numbers of young artists banded together to form a range of art collectives across small and large urban centers in India. Disparate notions of collectivity animated such instances of coming together. Next slide. While some groups, for instance the group Non-Representational of Bombay, cohered around formal preoccupations, the founding of a host of other now obscure collectives, such as the Unknowns Group and the Nine Painters of New Delhi, testify to a range of pragmatic initiatives undertaken by artists to compensate for the lack of an established exhibitionary infrastructure by self-organizing. Members of the Group 1890 had themselves participated in several such collectives. Ambadas Khobragade, for instance, had initiated the group Non-Representational, while Eric Bowen was part of the Unknown Group. Next slide. Likewise, Gulammohammed Sheikh exhibited with the Baroda group of painters, and Jeram Patel was a member of the Ahmedabad Progressive Painters. As for Swaminathan, next slide, the artist had become a full-time worker of the Communist Party as early as 1945. Communists, as Althusser had once remarked, are never alone. Swaminathan's withdrawal from the Communist Party occurred sometime in the mid-1950s, when the ground for articulating a vision of a collective life shifted for the artist from an investment in the promise of an egalitarian future, also an exemplary feature of modernism in art, as many have argued, to an enchantment with the transience of the now, enshrined as it was in the moment of the group 1890 in the early 1960s. But I'm getting ahead of the narrative that I wish to recount here. In some senses, in the 1940s, the earlier art collectives, for instance, next slide, the Bombay Progressive Artist Group and the Delhi Shilpi Chakra, exemplify initial attempts to combine individual aesthetic predilections with a new sense of collectivity that marked the inauguration of the independent nation in 1947. Next slide. Buoyant with optimism, the new country had set forth on a course of accelerated modernization and industrial advancement on the US model, implemented through a controlled economy and Soviet-style 5-year plans. As I've argued elsewhere, the collective destiny envisaged for the nation by its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had set into motion a dialogic between modernism and societal modernization, which in turn transformed aesthetic practices into a fertile ground for imagining a future that was not merely a protraction of the past. The political collective and the institution of art collectives also acquired an intractable dialogic resilience. The adoption of the form of a collective underlined differing ambitions and self-conceptions, of course. But one way or the other, the very act of assembling as a group remained inseparable from the promise of a more equitable post-colonial modernity. Next slide. By the 1960s, however, the initial euphoria of independence had all but run its course. Debates surrounding the establishment of the two primary national art institutions, the National Gallery of Modern Art and the Lalitkala Academy, had galvanized the artist community in the 40s and the 50s. But within years of their establishment, both institutions were already failing, mired as they were in complex bureaucratic machinations of the post-colonial government. Next slide. Not unlike the hydraulic projects that the state held forth as glistening symbols of progress, even as Nehruvian technocracy negotiated limited gains with vast economic and ecological losses. The fragility of the new post-colonial order may have exerted a substantially different kind of pressure on the very notion of collectivity in the 1960s. Faced with an already tottering art infrastructure, artists now increasingly turned to structures of self-organization via the form of art collectives that took the space of the art exhibition as the primary domain of visibility and action. Numerous collectives were formed and exhibitions organized expeditiously. But in most instances, artists assembled as a group for 1, 2, or 3 exhibitions, dispersing thereafter to reassemble in other equally transient collectives. Next slide. It would be easy to fold the group 1890 into this longer trajectory of rapid gathering and speedy dispersal. However, doing so would render opaque a carefully orchestrated breach that signaled something more otherworldly than either the national or the international modern, a crack that pulsated, as it were, with the vibrations of matter embedded deep within the embroils of the earth itself. Next slide. If anything, the group 1890 conceived the 1963 exhibition as a site to manifest a whole new world of experience and to open up the threshold for the passage into a state of freedom, as their manifesto described it. At face value, in a post-colony, the word freedom has a strikingly familiar ring. Arguably, the question of aesthetics and the question of freedom has always been caught in a tight dialogic bind in South Asia from the 19th century onwards, as the Manifesto too acknowledged. Independence had further tightened the bind between artistic projects and national projects, caught as artists were in questions of identity, authenticity, and the dreary temporality of a belated modernity. Next slide. More than others in the group, it was Swaminathan, the Marxist, who had worked hard to propel into the realm of representation the figural presence of the working class, heroic, resolute, larger than life. Urban precarity had been his subject in the early years. Next slide. In 1956, he had even amplified the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, now considered the first war of independence, into an iconic event on a global scale via a figurative allusion to Picasso's Guernica. Next slide. The 1890 Manifesto, in contrast, spoke of an iconism that sought an orientation away from such logocentricisms. As the Manifesto claimed, art for us is not born out of a preoccupation with the human condition. We do not sing of man, nor are we his messiahs. The function of art is not to interpret and annotate, comprehend and guide. This may seem heroic in an age where man hungers for vindication. This, for us, is but the perpetuation of the death wish of the state of unfreedom of man. Against the assurance of the still developing country's certain progress towards a techno-rational future of proverbial plentitude, the Group 1890 offered a rather different conception of movement, a movement without a determined destination, as Paz put it on behalf of the group. To say that we don't know with entire certainty where we are going is a proof of our lucidity. Absurd in gesture and defiant of reason, the declaration has a surrealist ring. Much like a happening, the 1963 exhibition with which the collective manifested itself as a group took the form of a choreographed unveiling, also replete with surrealist gestures. The exhibition took place at the Ravindra Bhavan galleries of the Lalit Kala Academy. Next slide. Despite the group's self-articulated antipathy towards Nehruvian modernity, it was Jawaharlal Nehru who inaugurated the exhibition. The inaugural occurred at the threshold of the gallery. Thereafter, an impatient audience was made to sit for over half an hour simply to gain admittance. The interval between the inaugural and the actual encounter of the audience with the works concretized for some critics the absolute separation that the group's manifesto demanded between the work of the artist and the field of experience opened up by the work themselves. Although not all assessments of the exhibition were equally positive, the works, the art critic Shamlal recounted, spun their own magic. Next slide. At the far right of the exhibition hall were Jeram Patel's sculpturesque wood paintings, whose surfaces the artist had gouged out with a blowtorch, leaving blackened scars reminiscent of the deep traces of geological time. Next slide. In his drawings, these marks of time, etched onto wood, often assumed fantastic shapes that reached far into the recesses of the earth's body. As Ghulam Sheikh would write several years later, Patel's drawings brought back memories of fetal darkness, the history in the womb. In this ritual, curious flora and fauna participated. That the female body becomes the body of the earth is hardly radical. What is interesting, at least in the 1960s, is the human non-human continuum that was hereby enunciated intuitively. Next slide. A similar elemental consciousness was discernible in Himmat Shah's paper collages, where the surface became an analogy for parchment to skin and the burnt lines, the accretions of wound. Having accidentally burnt a piece of paper with a cigarette, Shah had become mesmerized by the fragility of paper and the precocity of its surface at a time when the fact of flatness had gathered discursive density within the field of international modernism. Next slide. By this time, Swaminathan too had developed a symbolic vision that was at once shamanic and evocative of signs scratched onto the walls of dwellings in rural India. For Swaminathan, such signs may have been replete with occult potentiality. He would have been alert to the irrationality that signs ciphered. After all, in 1955, he had watched with rapt attention as a witch doctor cured a young child of a snake bite by chanting and dousing the poisonous bite with copious amounts of water in a Kotu tribal village in Batul. The incident had left an impression deep enough for him to recount the incident in an autobiography scripted in 1974. What had struck him most was the fact that the snake, which was imprisoned for this duration in an earthen pot, was returned to the wilderness once the victim was cured. Next slide. Raghav Canaria, the sole sculptor in the group, created abstract sculptures using industrial scrap. His practice revolved around mining the debris of modernity, the excesses of industrialization, as it were, to re-enchant trash. Even as the use of industrial scrap metal appears to operate well within systems of mid-century international sculptural modernism, his techniques and impulses were very much driven by the counter-logic of jugaad, a logic that often serves as the creative loci of informal labor across South Asia, enchanting form and material with newer nuances. Canaria, after all, had arrived upon sculpture to avoid the exorbitant expenses of oil painting and imported brushes. To compensate for the absence of a welding machine, he had resorted to the artisanal technique of manually embedding wooden frames with metal embellishments to replicate the effect of soldering. The sculptures then camouflaged an aesthetic subterfuge that countered modernist abstractions claimed to surface purity. Despite dissonant formal preoccupations, an agile conception of materiality animated the collective. Next slide. If Canaria tapped into industrial modernity's excess to re-assimilate waste back into the world as value, next slide, Jeram Patel perceived the act of making itself as an event, an encounter with the qualities inherent to material. Consistently, the artist reaffirmed that he did not create and that the work of art had no communicative potential. Instead, the act of making was the event, a happening, opening up a passage into the communicative potential internal to material itself. Therefore, he exposed the surface of wood with a blowtorch, thus releasing a field of primal energy. Next, Swaminathan had spoken of painting in precisely these terms, in terms of an encounter, a unique experience, a miraculous revelation, a thing of wonder, as when a child first opens its eyes to its surroundings. The work did not proceed from an idea, Swaminathan maintained. A work of art is magical, not bound to the logic of modern rationality, rather replete with occult vitality. The image enters the world as the artist gives himself over to its magicality. Once born, the work enters the space of the viewer, pulsating with the very same occult energy. It is difficult to believe in magic today, the art critic Shyam had observed in his reflection on the 1963 exhibition. Next slide. But for Paz, the experience was analogous to being surrounded by infinity. Infinity, for Octavio Paz, lay beyond the outward reaches of Western modernity. It splintered the time of history to a zone beyond the reaches of Western modernity's self-assured progress towards a techno-rational future. For Paz, the true intellectual cadaver of our time is not Marxism, but the idea of history as the depository of a mythical transcendence. Recognizing the idea of modernity as irrevocably aligned with a post-Enlightenment conception of history as unique and linear process of succession, Paz sought the end of history in the immeasurability of infinity. These ideas were no doubt shaped by his reading of the Mexican Revolution, his perception of the anteriority of colonial rape, endlessly reproduced rather than transcended in the march of historical time, and his understanding of indigenism as an intimate haunting of an interiority that could, if excavated, serve as the wellspring of an indigenous modernity. To be sure, this modernity had within it an embedded sense of what we now recognize as contemporaneity, an anachronism, disjointed relationship to time in Agamben's terms. But for Paz, as for Swaminathan, this contemporaneity had a very precise beginning and a very specific relationship to history. It belonged to the former peripheries, India, Mexico, and elsewhere, in a way that modernism had never. As early as 1950, Paz had argued that the logic of modernity, its tradition of rupture, had come to a grinding halt with the post-war fracturing of the center and the simultaneous rise of the Third World, whose revolts and national rebellions he recognized as the insurrection of particularisms oppressed by another particularism that wears the mask of universality, namely Western capitalism. If the collapse of the center had rendered all places peripheral, then the aesthetics of this universal peripherality, the poetics of the now, in Paz's terms, was poised at the end of the telos of Western modernity. Next slide. Such a possibility of an indigeneity beyond history would have resonated with Jagdish Swaminathan, at whose prompting the Group 1890 had gathered and who, stepping outside of India's post-independence drive to catch up with the West, had polemically declared, "I stand where the first man stood." Next slide. As for Paz, to say that we don't know with entire certainty where we are going is a proof of lucidity, Paz had written in his introduction to the exhibition. The use of the collective plural we as opposed to they, that is Group 1890, is significant. For the collective plural opened up a labyrinth through which the Creole worlds of Mexico seeped out, blended, and in an ultimate act of post-colonial diffusion, performatively became part of the moment of the Group 1890. Thank you.